We are happy to be back with this series for our April show. And tonight we are going to be discussing the book Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz, with the author Dr. Chris Washburn. Before we get into the program, I just want to give a shout out to the Bronx Music Heritage Center's programming. We are supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the New York State Legislature, public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Howard Gilman Foundation, the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund, and the Live Music Society. So for today's program, Bobby Sanabria, the other artistic director at the Bronx Music Heritage Center, we will be interviewing Dr. Chris Washburn about his latest book. And for those of you watching on our Facebook page, you can ask questions while you're watching. Please put any questions you have into the Facebook comment section, and we will make sure we get them to Chris, and he can answer them live for you right now while we're watching. So today, as I mentioned, our guest is Dr. Chris Washburn. He wears many hats. He is the professor of music and ethnomusicology at Columbia University. He's the chair of the music department there and the founder of the Louis Armstrong Jazz Performance Program. He's, as well as an author, he's also a trombonist who's been on over 150 recordings, and he has played with many, many different musicians, including Bobby Sanabria, Tito Puente, Ruben Blades, Eddie Palmieri, Roswell Rudd, Celia Cruz, and so many others. And also, for those of you who recently saw that the documentary on HBO about Kenny G, I must say he was the nicest, politest talking head in the documentary. Everyone else was kind of mean to Kenny G, but Chris was the most polite and courteous and diplomatic about Kenny G's career. So that being said, we're going to talk about his new book, Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz, and it's a sort of a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, of course, because we work. Bobby Sanabria is a leading proponent of Latin jazz music. He's actually featured in Chris's book, Latin Jazz, the newest book, and also we do a lot of that programming at the Bronx Music Heritage Center. But also in some of the work that Bobby and I have done too, we've done a lot of research, for instance, on the history of the 369th Regimental Band from World War I. And when you deal with issues like this, many times the stories like these are the sort of the Latino history, and it kind of gets forgotten or is ignored or just forgotten. And and I think Chris talks about one of the things he asks very early on in the book. He asks, why isn't the music of Chico Ofredil, Puente, and Machito rarely treated simultaneously with or given equal weight to the music of Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong? So that's sort of the crux of the sort of conversation tonight. And Chris talks about how we have, in the United States, we have this conception of race. Our conception of race is binary, black and white. And I think that's why I brought up the 369th, because a story like the 369th Regiment during World War I, we only think of that in black and white. It was an all-black regiment. But a large portion of the regimental band at that time during World War I were actually Afro-Puerto Ricans. But a lot of people never get to hear that story. It's not mentioned in many of the books that talks about them. It definitely wasn't mentioned in Ken Burns' jazz documentary. So people miss out on this part of history. Not only does it leave out people's history, and also with the 369th, the most influential, most recorded composer in the Western Hemisphere, Rafael Hernandez, was part of that 369th band, and they don't even get to know that. People miss out on that history. So this sort of pervades that story, and as well as jazz history and jazz today. So to talk about this and why we hopefully how we can get past this sort of just seeing things in black and white and not seeing the nuance in the larger stories that make up and the complexities that make up these histories. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I want to welcome first Bobby to say a few words, and then he can introduce Chris.
Bienvenidos, damas y caballeros. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the place to be, the BMHC, the Bronx Music Heritage Center, virtually. The person you was just listening to and watching was the great folklorist and cultural anthropologist herself, Elena Martinez, who is the co-artistic director, along with yours truly, of the Bronx Music Heritage Center and the forthcoming Bronx Music Hall. And tonight's, we definitely have a distinguished guest. He's a very rare person in the sense that he comes from academia, but also comes from the streets as well, because he is a noted working trombonist. As Elena said, he's on over 150 albums as a trombonist, both in the world of jazz, in the world of salsa, which is Afro-Cuban music, the way we play it here in New York City and in Puerto Rico with the New York Puerto Rican community. And of course, tonight's topic, Latin jazz. I'm talking about the great Chris Washburn, who is a doctor, as Elena said, of ethnomusicology. He is also the author of the book Sounding Salsa, his recollections of the 1990s when the salsa scene was in a transitional mode. I would encourage all of you to really get the book if you are into the music, the culture, from both an academic point of view and also a socio-political one as well, because he addresses many issues in that book around that were happening at that time period. Chris, we know each other for many years. We shared the stage many times, the recording studio. It's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to have you here with us tonight on Music by the Book.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. And hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I am honored to be here. And also, I have just watched the Bronx Music Heritage Center grow from its very inception over the years. And I'm just so proud of what you and Elena have done and built there. And I can't wait till the music hall is ready. It's really something that is much needed in the borough where I also live.
The BX, that's right.
So, but thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Well, Chris, you first, so for the people that don't know who you are and your trajectory, how did you come to the music? Give us a little bit of background where you're originally from in the Midwest, and then how you got involved as getting training as a trombonist, etc., and then finally, eventually coming to New York City and getting involved hardcore in the salsa scene and the Latin jazz scene here in New York City.
Well, sure. I was born and raised in on a farm in Ohio, in Bath, Ohio, and kind of came up through that, something that we miss now, but all of the bands of the elementary schools and the middle schools of the Midwest. I mean, when I was growing up in the 1970s, everybody played an instrument, and but the thing is that growing up in a place like that, it was very homogeneous and very white. And I had no access or any introductions to Latin music, except for the the reruns of the I Love Lucy show, and that was basically it. And then the extent of it, but I remember that when I was in college, I went to Peabody's Down Under, which is a pretty well-known music club in Cleveland, and to see the Tito Puente Orchestra. And it was the very first time that I got to see any Latin jazz or Afro-Cuban jazz or whatever you want to call it at that point, up close and personal. And I remember that was kind of a transformative experience for me. I didn't know what I was listening to, but I was totally digging it. And it wasn't until many years later when I was in Boston studying at the New England Conservatory, studying both classical music and jazz in the third stream studies department there, where I got the opportunity at the last minute to go sub on a band that was a Colombian band that played cumbia, salsa, and merengue. And I remember I had no idea what I was going to get into, and I went and subbed that night, and it was really like love at first hearing and love at first playing. There was something so compelling about the rhythms, about the vibe of those bands, that I wanted to know more. And I remember that I guess my enthusiasm got me hired that night. And I could also play really loud and strong, and from playing in so many rock bands and blues bands. And the next day I went to a local record store. At that point, that was how we would get our music, and asked for some records that had salsa on it, and the guy, luckily for me, the guy was either New Rican or Puerto Rican that was working behind the counter. He got a glint in his eye and he said, "These are the only two albums you need to get started." And it was Eddie Palmieri's White Album and Eddie Palmieri's The Son of Latin Music. And so I took those home and I put them on, and I heard Barry Rogers play trombone, and then I was hooked. I was like, that's what I want to do. And
just so, as an aside, when you asked the person behind the counter at the record store, did you tell them I play trombone
No, I didn't even say that. I just said I'm a musician. I played this gig last night. It was a salsa band, and they
right.
played cumbia and merengue, and I totally dig the music, but I don't know anything about it. I'd like to buy some records. That's all I said, and that's what he gave me. So at that point, it was like, that would be in the right place at the right time with the right person, and I don't know who it was, and I just I'm grateful for wherever he is right now.
You got to
For
go
that
back and see if that record store is still there.
It doesn't. I did. I was in Boston just for playing a gig a couple of years ago, and it was gone. Like
Wow.
so many of the other small record stores, and so I started to study that music the way that I studied jazz, where I was transcribing Barry's solos, I was transcribing Montuno's. I was really trying to get deep inside the structure of the music. And when I came to New York to work on my PhD at Columbia University, I had one number, and that was Rolando Briseño, the saxophone player's number, because I had been playing with a cousin of his in Boston and a friend of his. And so I called him up when I got to town, and he said, "Oh, I'm glad you called because we needed a trombone player at Boys Harbor School tonight at this rehearsal." And I showed up, and it was with Orlando Watusi, the saxophone, a Venezuelan salsa singer. And Oscar Hernandez was the musical director, and I went into a scene which was like right in the thick of it, and they were rehearsing for a record, and I remember they said after I played the rehearsal, and they were like, "Hey man, can you play lead on this recording session tomorrow?" And I'm like, "Sure." And like I hadn't even unpacked my bags; I just got to New York, and it was at Rudy Van Gelder's studio, and like now I'm like at the heart of like the jazz world, and from there on and in, I was totally hooked. And the second job I was called for was with Isidro Infante, and the other trombone player didn't show up at the rehearsal. I was really annoyed by that, and so I showed up at the gig, and he walks in, and it's Barry Rogers.
Wow!
So then
Talk about kismet.
And so that was about my first month in New York. So I came to New York at the right time, where salsa was, you could play 7 nights a week and make a living as a trombone player, just playing Latin music. And so that's how I got started on all of this.
What year was this? If you
I came in 89.
89. Wow. Now, just to go over some of the names you mentioned for the viewers and listeners that may not know any of these names, Barry Rogers is the premier trombonist in what the history of this music. From the way we play it in New York, he basically developed the New York City power trombone salsa sound that even is copied by trombonists in the birthplace of the music, Cuba. So he's well renowned, and he's iconic. He was transformative in the way Louis Armstrong was for the jazz trumpet and for jazz in general.
In many ways, that's right.
Great Puerto Rican pianist, composer, arranger, great band leader, and Oscar Hernandez, the premier pianist, New Yorican, from the South Bronx, an SOB like me, a son of the Bronx, and great composer, arranger, and band leader. And he's the musical director, founder, and band leader of the Spanish Harlem Orchestra, which is probably the leading orchestra today. It's probably the most booked band, and they get to play at jazz festivals as well. And Oscar has a small group as well called Alma Libre, which focuses particularly just on Latin, Afro-Cuban jazz. So, man, you got it right heavy thrown into the thick of things. And Rolando Briseño, for those of you who don't know, great Venezuelan alto player, multi-reed. He plays all the saxophones, great, incredible flute player, soprano sax player. He was the lead alto player with the Mario Bazar Afro-Cuban Jazz Orchestra for many years, and we worked together. And man, you got that. It is an amazing, amazing story. Hopefully, my students are tuning in, so that gives you an example of being at the right place, right time, and making associations with people. It's just amazing.
And I met you right after that, because they sent me to sub for Conrad at a rehearsal with the Mario Bazar orchestra, and that's when the first time we met.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then just for full disclosure, I called you from an airport. I believe it was because of a trombonist who shall remain nameless did show up to the airport for us to do a concert with my Nanette Ascension, and Chris saved the day and came in, and we've been musically associated
Yes.
ever since. Man, he did a fantastic job. Now, so you're in the thick of things, et cetera, and you're doing your due diligence. Actually, like as you said, taking the music very seriously, transcribing, listening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What was the Rubicon for you in terms of saying to yourself, wow, I need to form my own group, because you have a great group called Sai Otos. When did that happen? And describe the scene at the same time when you decided to form that group.
Well, sure. So when I was in New York, I was not only playing Latin music, I was playing a lot of jazz, and I was playing pop music and starting to do a lot of different types of recording as well. And because that was my dream, is really to become a studio musician in New York and do recordings. But I also noticed that a lot of my bandmates in the salsa scene, they were also trained jazz musicians. They had a love for jazz as well. And so I asked some of them, hey, let's form a group together. And I got a couple small gigs. So that started, I think, in probably 1991, which was where the Sayotos band started. And the person that was sitting next to me in the Tito Nieves band was Ray Vega. And so Ray Vega was my first horn partner, the great trumpet player, who played with Mongo Santa Maria for many years and also has a lot of records out himself. And so we got started that way. Started playing at places like the New Yorican Poets Cafe, as well as some other small clubs down in the village. And it was a way of combining these two loves, these two worlds that, they're very separate in many ways. They're separate in terms of genre. They're separate in kind of what the way they do. A lot of people get them confused. I mean, salsa, as you said so eloquently, it's kind of Afro-Cuban dance music, the way we play it in New York City. And Latin jazz is inflected a little bit differently. I wanted to do all of that. So that's why we got started in that. But the thing is that I was also at Columbia writing a dissertation and trying to do research on salsa for my own edification, and not finding anything in English except for a couple articles and one book. And that was it. And I thought, that's so strange. I could see the vibrant scene at night, and I could see like all the people coming to the Latin jazz gigs, and there was just nothing being written about this music except for a couple authors, right? And so that was the seed that began kind of a long quest to take advantage of me being in academia, but also being an advocate for this music that I really love, and also trying to counter these music histories that are written where salsa doesn't show up. And then more importantly, with the newest project, well, Latin jazz doesn't show up. And I remember getting hired at Columbia University to start teaching, and I had to do a jazz history class. And there was no textbooks that I could use that included anybody that I was working with and playing with at night. And there was no way that I could introduce my students to any of this music unless I created my own syllabus, my own playlist, my own tapes, and created my own content and material. And this was really troubling for me. And this was the moment where universities started to show a bit of an interest, music schools, of teaching this. So like at New England Conservatory, there was a Latin music ensemble, and had been for a couple of years. I think that's one of the first ones probably in the country that I know of, that was a regular course that people could take. But then the new school started having some interest. And I know they reached out to you, Bobby, and also Manhattan School of Music. I was hired at Manna School of Music to create an Afro-Cuban ensemble, and so we started to see this growth. But then all of a sudden now there's like no publishing industry. Like, where do you get the charts? All of this, and so it was really these kind of singular efforts that created publishing opportunities for distribution. That's when 3-2music.com was founded, where people could actually get this music, so you could bring it into schools and you could have students teach it. And I know you've been instrumental in collecting a huge libraries for your students to play, which is really wonderful, but we just didn't have that. And I really wanted to do something about that. And it took me a little while, but this newest book, Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz, is the result of this problem.
Right. Well, let's start doing a deep dive into this new tome that you have. I would say that, and we've talked about this before, you could literally use this book if you were going to do a lawsuit against the jazz community in general, in terms of their indifference to the history of the contributions of Latin musicians to the birth of jazz, its evolution, and its continuation into the future. You could use this tome as a legal argument. Any lawyer could, because it's beautifully laid out in superb detail. We've talked about this over the years and many times, but you did the due diligence and really sat down and to make the argument so that really nobody can question you or anyone else that makes that same argument. And for me, the most glaring example of that was the Ken Burns 18-hour documentary series on PBS, where there was no mention at all. The Chano Pozo, the great conga player that played with Dizzy Gillespie, and the person that wrote Manteca, which is considered one of our anthems in the genre, was mentioned like for 8 seconds, and I think Bossa Nova for 3 seconds, and that was it. You know, I mean, and it was glaringly, for our community, if you're Latino, Latina, it was just insulting.
Yeah.
I'll be just very, very frank. So, uh, take us into the book. Let's do a deep dive. Start off where the reasons for this omission, this indifference, etc., toward our contributions to the history of jazz. Where does it come from?
Well, I think there are several sources of the reasons why this music gets systematically erased. And it gets erased in a variety of different ways. So one of the things that this book does is first document erasure. Like, what does erasure look like? How does it happen? And it happens in really subtle ways and pretty obvious ways too sometimes. And oftentimes it's not for, devious reasons. It can be, for really naive ways. And so we have to kind of look at the entire history of jazz scholarship, but then we also have to look at the entire history of this music and where this music comes from. So I did both of these things. The first thing I did was kind of look into really poignant moments in the history of this music when things happened, and then the results of those things. So the first thing is that you can, you kind of figure out, well, when did people start talking about this type of music and naming it something, naming it Latin jazz? And as I went back in history, I started to look and see and realize that, the term Latin jazz being affixed to a genre of music or kind of an umbrella term doesn't really come about until the 1960s. And it doesn't really have more common usage until the 70s even. But what was happening before that? Because there's a very interesting quote that happens in 1938 when Jelly Roll Morton, the New Orleans pianist, is being interviewed by Alan Lomax. And in that interview, he says that for jazz to have the right feel, it has to have the Spanish tinge. And, that's a moment that people say, oh, wait a minute, what's that? What is he talking about? And that's when it starts getting really complicated, because here he is saying that when he's saying Spanish, he's really referring to musical styles and cultures coming from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Central America, and Latin America. And so speaking about those folks that speak Spanish. And why is that? Well, he was from New Orleans, and New Orleans being such a central node for, how jazz emerges. Jazz emerges in a lot of different places, but that's really a central node. And it was the cultural complex and the uniqueness of New Orleans that produced this truly uniquely music from the United States. And it grows out of the Black experience in New Orleans. It's a Black music. It comes out and emerges out of African-American culture or its antecedents or its precedents. And so that's very central to this music. And if we think about it that way, then this music is a Black music coming from New Orleans. But what does Black mean in New Orleans? Because New Orleans is the only city in the entire United States that never adopted just a binary code of Black and white race. It always had a third race, the Creoles, and a lot of things in between. So their entire system, kind of the socio-cultural system of differentiating differences with race, doesn't really compute for the rest of the country. And in fact, the rest of the country didn't adopt the Black-white binary until about 1897 through a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson and the one-drop rule in terms of how to determine if someone was Black or white. And that kind of dictated the laws ever since. But if jazz was first recorded in 1917, its antecedents appeared before that. What led up to this music kind of coming onto the scene predates 1897. And so what he was referring to is that in many ways, New Orleans can be seen as during the 1800s, one of the northernmost Caribbean cities. And that it was ruled by the Spanish and then the French and then the Spanish and then the French, eventually purchased it by the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. So in that sense, the architecture, the food, the music, the way people are, their vibe, it's different than the rest of the United States, and it still is with that legacy. And that is the place that jazz emerges. So where does Black culture come from in New Orleans? And it took me a long time to get to the root of Black culture. Like, how did Black culture arrive? And it wasn't until 1716 and 1717, when the first enslaved peoples were brought into New Orleans, where we started to see kind of these West African infused traditions emerge in that milieu. But where did those people come from? They were not West Africans. They were actually enslaved peoples born in Martinique and Guadeloupe. So the first infusion of Afro-Caribbean culture starts before New Orleans is even kind of formed it's just a small little port at that time. And it immediately almost doubles the population of that region with half Afro-Caribbean peoples and the colonizers. And this kind of importation and reinfusion of not only Caribbean culture, but also West African enslaved peoples that were brought in a little after that, up until the early 1800s, kept reinfusing the city. Not only that, because it was a French-ruled territory, the relationship to the enslaved peoples was very different than the relationship to those enslaved peoples in the Protestant colonizers north of that city.
Yeah, the French are Catholics, yeah.
They are. And in the Catholic traditions, there's a couple of things that start to take place. One is that, there's every single enslaved person needs to be converted to Catholicism as a rule. And so what ends up happening is they're brought into the religious traditions of the local peoples. And not only that, there also is, the belief in miscegenation, of making them a whiter race. So there's much more interracial mixing than there were up north. And not only that, there had to be a way of manumission or a way of buying freedom. structure in place and so there were larger freed people of color communities in that area in any other area in the United States. This sets up a very different kind of cultural dynamic. When jazz emerges, what Jelly Roll Morton was talking about was those rhythmic traditions that were very much alive and heard every weekend in Congo Square, where many of the enslaved peoples on their day off could sell kind of goods and food that they actually built, planted and cultivated themselves in order to gain more money to buy their freedom. And there was a whole infrastructure in place that was caused by a drought and early on in the history of New Orleans, where there was a huge famine for everybody, and it was almost all wiped up. And it was only the Bambara people from West Africa who knew how to cultivate crops in that kind of swampy region that actually fed the community and actually saved the city. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why Congo Square was always seen as a place where it was to great benefit of the society, but it was also a place where those West African peoples and Afro-Caribbean peoples could preserve some of their performance styles, their drumming, their songs, their rhythms, and those traditions. And it was those people and their rhythms that laid the groundwork for early jazz, a lot of the rhythmic foundation. And that's what Jelly Roll was talking about in 1938. In other words, when the word jazz gets used in New Orleans in 1917 as a genre name, it's actually referring to music that's Afro-Caribbean infused. And if you look at it that way and you follow the logic of this argument, which I do in the book, actually Latin jazz begins in 1716, way before jazz does. And that what ends up happening is if we follow the trajectory to 1945, and 1946 through 48, where Dizzy Gillespie starts breaking out on his own and he starts to collaborate with Chano Pozo, the great Cuban conguero, and they show up at Carnegie Hall with him and a whole new body of work built around these Cuban rhythms that he learned from his very close friend, Mario Balza. When they come up and they ask him, what is this music called? Since he was someone that was at the forefront of the bebop revolution with Charlie Parker, he says, it's Cubop, which is this cute marketing label that was genius because he was providing all the writers a title for this new music, this new kind of improved thing as a marketing label, as a way to sell this music. It also was very close to his heart, right? It was a way for him to kind of explore his own West African heritage by way of Cuba. It was vitally important, especially in 1948, which is like right in the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. The Congress for Racial Equality starts in 1943. There's a lot of publications and people talking about about equality, especially in the years after World War II. But at the same time, it's cute marketing label. It's also very meaningful for Dizzy Gillespie, who was very committed to Afro-Cuban music and traditions and learned and was a student of those traditions. But what it did is it started to, by label, differentiate this music in a way that was different for the jazz audiences. Now, he wasn't the first to do this, right? Machito and Mario Balza were doing this beforehand. But but Dizzy's stature in the jazz community as one of the big stars and the rising stars at that moment really put it on the map. And then he became kind of this part of this naming game to rename genres as a way to differentiate your music from the past or your music from other folks. And if you look at what jazz was called up to that point, it was called jazz, it's called swing. Then it was called bebop. And then all of a sudden you get cubop. And then all of a sudden you get like cool jazz, you get soul jazz, you get all of these other labels that come every couple of years. And the new into fusion or jazz rock, all as smooth jazz, it just goes on and on and on. And it's kind of part of the game. But what ends up happening is it creates segregation. And it creates segregation within the jazz community at the same time that the civil rights movement is really getting underway. And there's a huge fight for a black space. And in many ways, there's no space for the middle ground, the beige, the mulatto, the tan, and the brown. And that's the legacy that we have to contend with. And that is one of the reasons why this music gets erased, because when Black artists are fighting for a space for their own music and for their acknowledgement, if you say, well, yeah, there's these Black artists, there's also these brown artists that are really important too, but it's all Black music, it's going to completely confuse the kind of the mainstream way of thinking about it. And so that's what we end up getting. We get this legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is an artificially imposed ideal of the conceptions of race.
It's fascinating to me because this imposed segregation music in the titles and et cetera of the or the naming of those styles, et cetera, is a thing that was propagated by white jazz critics who did not acknowledge. I mean, I've never seen from that. I've read so many different things from this gentleman John Simon and many others, Leonard Feather. Nobody acknowledged the Machito Afro-Cubans and Mario Bazar as the creators of what we call today Afro-Cuban jazz, the first form of Latin jazz. They always gave the credit to Dizzy in a way saying to the public, well, you know, these Afro-Latinos, they don't have, they're subtly saying they don't have the creativity, the intelligence, the sophistication, the education to create this fusion of Afro-Cuban rhythms with jazz arranging technique and the creativity of the jazz solos, which is what Mario did with the Machito Afro-Cubans, or started to do, Mario Bazar in 1939. To me, it's just fascinating. And of course, when I would speak about this with Mario, he just fluffed it off and everything because he was more concerned about the music. But he didn't even realize he in his naming of the band, Machito and the Afro-Cubans, Machito being his brother-in-law, Francisco Raúl Gutiérrez Grillo de Ayala, the frontman, the singer of the band, his brother-in-law, Mario being the musical director. This was a incredibly powerful moment, in my opinion, in the terms of the civil rights movement coming from a musical standpoint. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things where it's not acknowledged, and it's so insane. Let's start with Dizzy and we can work backwards. So in Dizzy's biography, or autobiography, he talks about his relation with Chano Pozo and his interaction with him. And he said, Chano didn't speak English and I didn't speak Spanish, but it didn't matter because together we spoke African. And so the thing.
The dog is speaking. The dog is speaking.
Yeah. And
actually, the dog is agreeing with you.
Absolutely. And the thing is that what's so significant about that statement? The statement is that in 1948, there was no way for jazz artists to be traveling back to West Africa to explore their roots. But what he recognized in Chano's traditions and his embrace of the Afro-Cuban traditions, that's like a public acknowledgement of pride in your West African roots. That was something that was missing in the Black scene, especially the jazz scene at that moment. And for him, it was a coming home. It was a homecoming, a discovery of a shared collective history that was so essential. And of course, when the African nations start to gain their independence in the late 1950s, jazz musicians start going back to Kenya. They start to go back to Ghana and various places to kind of find their own roots. But at that point, it really wasn't that available for many of them to do that. So Cuba served an essential role in that. But if we think about the roots of the civil rights movement, one of which is the writings of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey's Jamaican. And and this connection to the West Indies is vitally important for these ideas, because he was borrowing from the intellectual writers of the Caribbean and incorporating those ideas and kind of popularizing it and disseminating it up north, and having a fundamental role. But then if we go into jazz histories that talk about the civil rights and they talk about segregation and all, they always go to the Benny Goodman Band of 1938 as the first, desegregated jazz band, when he had Lionel Hampton, Teddy Wilson in the band. And it was huge because Benny Goodman was a huge star and he was playing for white audiences. And he was indeed the first person that insisted that these musicians play. And he was someone that was a problematic character in many ways, but he was someone that was really dedicated to highest standards of music. And he used Black arrangers early on to write his music, the best arrangers in New York City. But he found these musicians he wanted to collaborate with, and he insisted that they come and play with him. And because of his stature, he could do that. But what's not talked about is he's not the first person to play for a white audience with a desegregated or multiracial band. And that was Don Aspiaso and his Havana Casino Orchestra in 1930. Right. And they came and they played at in Midtown for a bunch of white audiences with a complete mixed race band, but they were from Cuba, right? And so the people didn't quite understand how to identify the race of these folks because they were coming from someplace else. But what you don't realize is that he was one of the first band leaders to desegregate the music scene down in Cuba. He was someone that was very dedicated to bringing street elements, street singers into the band, into these kind of higher society orchestras that were the best paying gigs. And he insisted upon it. And he broke down those racial divides in the 1920s. And he is not acknowledged for that at all. And there's of course, desegregation actually happened within the musician scenes and after-night jam sessions, but not for white audiences, right? It happened on recording sessions, but not where people were actually seeing it. And so these are just the moments that without these folks that I didn't identify Black or white, they were fundamental in establishing the United States as we know it today. And they, and you can kind of go through history of all of these really important figures that completely transformed our histories and the way that we do things. Even the three camera shoot, right, was Desi Arnaz on the I Love Lucy show, establishing new norms, the way that, they still use them today in television and also in a variety of different filmmaking enterprises. And we just don't see that. And it's just not written about. And it really bugs me. And that's what this book is about.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much. I wanted to before I turn it over to Elena right now, I just wanted to put some more meat on the matter. The Don Aspiaso Orchestra, those of you who are watching, you can check them out. There's actually quite a few films of them in black and white on YouTube. You can check them out. You can also check out their great singer, Antonio Machin, who is Black Cuban in front of the band. Machin, for lack of a better term, his phenotype was white. Aspiaso, for lack of a better term, his phenotype was white. He's the pianist when you see these videos of the band performing in the 1930s. Definitely something you need to see. And of course, their hit tune was El Manicero, which they recorded, the Peanut Vendor, which is in a style known as a pregón, a song, folk song, pregón, a vendor song. Became a hit, became such a hit, even though it was in Spanish across the country, that Louis Armstrong recorded his own version of it. Red Nichols recorded his own version, and it's part and parcel of the repertoire of any self-respecting New Orleans musician.
And not only that, when the New York Times comes out and says Bad Bunny is the first one to have a hit on the Billboard 200 that's all in Spanish, an album that's all in Spanish and come number one in the United States. That's only because the Billboard 200 did not exist in 1930, because if it had, it would have been Don Aspiazu, who actually had the first hit in Spanish in all of the United States.
Yes, amazing, amazing. Thank you, Chris.
So,
well, I'm going to turn it over to Elena Martinez. Elena?
one of the questions I wanted to ask, in your book, you give various examples when Latin jazz bands are able to play the music of a jazz band, a swing band, but a jazz orchestra can't play the Latin music stuff, the Latin jazz stuff, because there's just different elements that they're just not used to. There's clave to be contend with, and all these different things. And is that a sign of? I think, is there a couple reasons for that? There's this lack of knowledge. There's this disrespect and not wanting to learn this other tradition. You talk about in your book, there's some scholars who talk about jazz is black, so it comes from Africa. But of course, that skips over the Caribbean, Latin America, New Orleans. And then you also mentioned Benny Powell of Count Basie's orchestra is quoted as saying, the rhythms we played during riffs were African. They come from Africa. So there's this, erasure, like you said, keep not even a mention of the middle part, that one step, Latin America and New Orleans. And so, why is this? How has jazz musicians themselves sort of kept down this music? That they haven't learned it. Have they seen it because it's mostly drums and rhythms, so it's not as sophisticated? Maybe can you talk a little bit about that? How the jazz scene itself has sort of kept it down also.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a newer phenomenon, keeping it down, actually, because one of the most interesting things that I came across, who my good friend Evan Christopher, the clarinetist from New Orleans, shared with me, was this ad from the New York Times in 1917 for Reisenheimer's a dance hall, an event that was happening. Now, Reisenheimer's was at Columbus Circle. That was like this big party center, is in the exact location that Jazz in Lincoln Center is now. So this is what was happening in that location, that exact same block in 1917. And it was a dance of the exotica. And that there were Ouija boards, there were fortune tellers, and there were dance instructors teaching the newest and latest jazz dance. And the featured band was the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which was there was 5 white guys from New Orleans who were mimicking a lot of the black artists at the time. They were really good musicians, but they weren't the innovators. It was because the record industry didn't think that black bands could sell to white audiences, so they recorded a white band playing jazz, early jazz. This was the band that established the name jazz as the genre, and they also claimed their own originality. It was a lot of shtick, but what's the most amazing thing is it's not only they're not even going to, at this place, they're not only teaching the latest jazz dance, but they're also going to teach the latest danson.
The Cuban danson, yeah.
Cuban danson, which was like the kind of the most popular dance in Cuba, in kind of the national rhythm. And guess who was playing the danson? The original Dixieland Jazz Band. Now, I would have never known about this had Evan not stumbled across this ad. I don't know why he was looking at newspapers from 1917, but it was just a goldmine, because what it did is it kind of opened up a window to the fact that the top jazz band, the most famous jazz band commercially of 1917, when jazz first emerges, and the first band to actually travel overseas in 1919 and have the first global tour, they played dansons. They played Afro-Cuban music.
Yeah.
That's why it's the Spanish tinge. So there's no differentiation between this. When Don Aspiazu was playing in Cuba, he was playing at casinos, and he was playing, for the North American tourists, and also for the kind of the wealthy Cuban elite. And guess what? He was playing jazz and he was playing Afro-Cuban dance music, and they would do a mixture of both on all of their sets. Because of the popularity of his success here in the United States, he landed one of the best society gigs in New York City in the Rainbow Room on the top of the NBC studios. And the Rainbow Room was known for catering to the latest dance trends, and they always hired two bands. They hired, because of Don Aspiazo's success, they would hire a Latin band to play kind of the latest Caribbean styles, and then they would hire a swing band that would play the swing styles of the day. And what Don Aspiazo did is they each played a half an hour set, and then they had this one song that was a transition song, and it would be seamless music, and the other band would come up and play. So you could dance with continuous music all night. So by 1930, they wanted to hire the top rumba bands of the day and the top swing bands of the day. But Don Aspiazo refused to only play rumba or Afro-Cuban music. He would always throw in like a hit of a swing tune with a swing rhythm, because his band was really good at it. They were, they could play both, just like so many of the early jazz bands could do it. And by the early or mid 1930s, there was already this differentiation that was starting, where they were like, wait a minute, none of these dancers want to hear a Cuban band playing jazz or swing. And he just like, no, they don't want to hear a swing band play Cuba, because they were selling authenticity. And this was a breakdown. And Don Aspiazo said, that's insane. We're going to play whatever we want to play. And he got fired. And he was willing to lose the best gig in New York City over that philosophical stance. And that divide has continued. When I was playing in the Rainbow Room in the 1990s, the exact same thing happened to Mauricio Smith, who was one of the best jazz flautists on the scene. He's a Panamanian musician who did a lot of recording in all different types of genres. And he got hired as the band leader to lead the rumba band in the 1990s. And he got fired for the exact same reason, by playing some things that were not deemed appropriate for a Latin band.
And just to show, just to talk about Mauricio a little bit. Mauricio was the original tenor saxophonist on Saturday Night Live.
That's right.
Saturday Night Live, and he's also the harmonica player when you see Dan Aykroyd go out with the Blues Brothers and those skits that they did on Saturday Night Live in the early days. He'd be faking the funk out there, mimicking that he's playing the harmonica, the blues harp, and it's Mauricio backstage behind a curtain on a microphone doing that. An incredible musician, Mauricio Smith. He was an avatar of always hiring, because he got to the point where he would be contracting studio dates, and he started contracting musicians who were Latino, who were versatile to play in the studios, etc. So we have a lot to thank him for. He never gets the credit. I'm so glad that you mentioned his name. Elena, you wanted to continue.
I just wanted to finish answering her question, because
Sure.
because it's not only the business infrastructure that started to making this distinction. What we start to see, especially in the aftermath of Dizzy, is that musicians start to make this distinction. And there was a kind of almost a growing disdain or a distance and more otherness, especially in the 1960s, after the 1960s, because the top hits, like the best-selling jazz records of the 1960s, were music that was not necessarily coming from the jazz mainstream. So I'm thinking about Mungo's Watermelon Man, and I'm thinking about the Desafinado coming from Brazil with Charlie Bird and Stan Getz. Some of the most popular music, the best-selling music, was coming from South America, Afro-Cuban music. It was falling kind of under this Latin jazz umbrella. And so there's also this kind of, if it was right at the moment where so much of the jazz musicians were pushing for jazz to be viewed more as art music. And when you have these really popular records, that doesn't fit within this kind of the art music confines. And so what we see is that it doesn't help the case for Latin jazz to be really accepted and undifferentiated before jazz, it actually further segregates it and says, okay, well, that's the kind of the popular, and this is not what we do. We do serious music.
And of course, the civil rights movement is coming to a head at the time, in terms of the African American community, and that concept of having a pan-Afro-Latin experience or embracing that had yet to be defined.
That's right.
The idea of dance that you started talking about, you talked about in your book when jazz became less associated with dance, because you said, which I didn't realize, swing and Latin music sort of came up at the same time, sort of emerged at the same time and cross-fertilized a lot. But then as jazz became less associated with dance, I guess that's maybe in the bebop era, the Caribbean connection sort of started getting downplayed. And is that because bebop is this serious, way too, the musicians, you all take yourself way too seriously, and bebop and stuff, that's way too serious, music. If dancing is not for sophisticated musicians, so it's not seen as sophisticated enough. And then you even get people like Ray Barretto. You talk about Ray Barretto never liked to call himself a Latin jazz musician. He'd rather be called a jazz musician. Did he see it because jazz is more sophisticated? He wanted to see it's more prestigious to be associated with a jazz form, not a dance form. Like that.
I'll talk about Ray in a minute because he's a unique case. But I don't think that jazz gets disassociated from dance in the bebop era. I think it comes later. There was still a lot of dancing happening in those bebop clubs. There was still a lot of tap dance that was going on. It was pretty vibrant. And the swing era and jazz dance continued. But what happens is a little after that, yes, that's when it starts to move away. And I think it's in the 1950s and especially into the 1960s where we don't really associate jazz with the newest dance crazes, right? And especially with rock and roll coming in, R&B coming in. I mean, basically the anthems of the civil rights were not jazz tunes, right? They were R&B or they were soul. In general, there are certainly examples in jazz that have musicians that were addressing this, right? You've got a lot of activists that are musicians, but they're not the ones they're not the anthems that they're singing at various rallies and things. So that gets separated. But yes, indeed, these musics that do become popular are kind of associated with dance and can be danced to, and especially Mongo's music, especially a lot of the bossa nova and things like that. And so as we move into the more avant-garde, as we move into the more esoteric forms of jazz, that's when it does get separated. And when you separate that, you separate a huge audience because you lose those folks that want to participate and want to be involved in the performance. And as soon as you're sitting quietly in a club and you're told that you can't talk and you can't even, as Charles Mingus says, you can't even shake the ice in your glass when we're playing, that's a different thing. That's a different crowd. That's a different way. And it does lose some of that popularity and resonance in popular culture. But at the same time, when we move into these art worlds, what are we trying to mimic? We're trying to mimic the art world performance style. So you go to a classical music, go to Carnegie Hall and listen. Listen to the audience. You don't hear them. They're just there listening. They'll applaud, and you feel the vibe as a performer. But the same kind of symbiotic relationship that happens a lot in a lot of Latin jazz performances even today in places where dance is not really supposed to happen, still happens. And it happens in Bobby's band in so many places. It happens when I play. I remember I played the first time I played at Carnegie Hall with Tito Puente was for the JVC Jazz Festival. And he said, they just told me before I came on stage, I have to make this announcement that the fire marshal there's no permit for dancing in this venue. And so according to the fire marshal, so you're not allowed to get out of your seats and dance. And of course, as soon as we started playing, everybody just stood up in the aisles and started dancing. And the ushers were going around trying to get them to stop. And they eventually just gave up. But that was at the JVC Jazz Festival, and I'm sure that is the only moment where people were dancing. But I mean, the thing is that those proponents of jazz as serious art music see that and say, well, wait a minute, like this music doesn't really belong here.
Yeah, they look at it as well. It's just popular music that for the masses, because of that element of being a that the music envelops you so much viscerally that you have to move and groove, not realizing that good jazz, whether it's being played by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers or whoever you want to use as an example, Dizzy, to go back to Dizzy, when the rhythm gets really intense, even though it may be just a straight ahead swing rhythm, it's going to make you want to move and groove viscerally, which is what the epitome of that. The height of it was reached during the swing era.
That's right.
So,
But the thing about Ray Barretto, though, that's a different issue. So Ray Barretto, being a huge salsa star and one of the most innovative salsa band leaders that we have and part of the Fania All-Stars, what many people that are big salsa fans don't know is that he was born and raised in New York City and grew up wanting to be a jazz musician, aspiring to be a jazz drummer, although he played congas, which was not an instrument that could fit into a lot of the scenes at that time. I mean, Chano Pozo popularized it, and there were a number of very important percussionists that kind of came in the wake of Chano. But the real difference is that the majority of those musicians and those conga players that came afterwards, not all of them, but the majority of them, were not born and raised in New York listening to music. In some ways, Ray's dream was to, be in Charlie Parker's band. And so there is a very famous recording with Red Garland and Red Garland's trio, where he invites Ray to play congas, and they play manteca. That's the name of the record. But he has Ray play on the swing tunes as well. And Ray was one of the first conga players to really be able to actually swing the rhythms. If you listen to the recordings of Chano Pozo, he's an amazing musician, but he doesn't really swing when he doesn't play the congos in the swing format the way that Ray can do that. He really just fit right in many ways. And I think that is at the root of why Ray doesn't want to be a Latin jazz artist. Because he fought from his early years to be accepted to play next to the greatest jazz drummers in the world, Art Taylor being, I think, the drummer on that record. And that was a battle, hard fought and won to some extent. And the conga drums became more incorporated in many, many different settings. There was also Candido, who came in and was very, very adaptable to be able to play in a lot of different settings. And the congas became a much more normal instrument to see in a jazz setting to some extent. But then when he started his small group, his sextet, they did play music that probably would be called Latin jazz for the majority of listeners. But from Ray's perspective, sure, it had that, but it wasn't because there was a conga drum there. It was because they would make these choices to play these rhythms, but they would also play straight ahead swing stuff. And he always wanted to be booked with, when the Blue Note would have 2 artists in a week, he'd always want to be paired with with a jazz artist, not a Latin jazz artist. And they never would do that for him. And it really made him angry. And when he would play in various jazz festivals, he didn't want people dancing. He wanted them listening like the other jazz groups got, where people just sat and listened and were really attentive. And it was a struggle for him his entire life. And I think for him, it was like to be accepted as a jazz musician, but being a New Yorican. That was his battle.
Which is still a struggle today.
Yes.
From a personal point of view, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
So I just want to say to everyone, please put in your questions. We do have a couple questions. I want to get to a couple of them now. But everyone listening, please put in some questions to the Facebook comment section. The first question I want to ask is just go back a little bit, what Chris was talking about a little while ago. This is from everyone's friend, Bertha Hotar. She's listening. She asked,
Bertha. Hi, Bertha.
See, as when you were talking earlier about some of the earlier musics, earlier in the century, wasn't jazz being performed in Cuba at that time already? When you were talking about, like, during, the Aspiasu band and everything, was jazz already being performed in Cuba at that time?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Bertha. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I do in this book is I'm writing primarily from kind of a New York centric perspective, and really talking about the folks that I play with and also the music traditions that were happening here. At the same time, more studies have to be written, especially in English, about what was actually happening in Cuba and other places in the Caribbean, because jazz was the first global pop music. It came out at the same time with the advent of radio, or the proliferation of radio. It emerges at the same time that the recording industry as we know it today exists. So it was like the first widely disseminated music. And not only that, my own personal feeling is that because it was so rooted in improvisation and kind of used the fundamental survival mechanisms that we all possess, that of spontaneous adaptability as the center of the art form, it really spoke cross-culturally to a lot of different cultures. And what we see is that wherever our military went, or wherever there was a tourist industry, or wherever there was an infrastructure for touring, jazz musicians would travel, and local nodes and iterations of jazz would emerge in those places, Havana being one of them. And that's the reason why Don Aspiaso was playing jazz, because that was the most popular music of the day, and that was what was being demanded of the dancers and the folks that were there. In the clubs, they wanted to listen to those songs that they were hearing on the recordings and they were hearing on the radio. So absolutely. And there's a few really good books that document the jazz in Cuba, but much more has to be done to talk about the relationship of what was going on there in those places and how it was resonating when it would come up here. One of the things I didn't mention before is one of the reasons why Don Aspiaso was so successful for the white audiences is that his band was a copy of the Fletcher Henderson Big Band, which was the #1 big band in the 1920s in New York City. He used the same instrumentation. He borrowed on many of the arranging techniques, and he would use the same types of sounds in his orchestra, although he added kind of the traditional son instruments as well. And that kind of familiarity, or exotica couched in familiarity, helped translate his Afro-Cuban music to those white audiences. I think it's the key to his success. And it was because he had been playing jazz and exposed to jazz for 10 years prior down in Cuba.
I wanted to acknowledge Berta. She's Dr. Berta Hotar.
That's right.
A fantastic ethnomusicologist whose studies and writing on the rumba tradition in Cuba and here in New York City are must reads. So thank you, Dr. Hotar, for your great question.
And we have another question from Bob Ramos. A lot of people know Bob Ramos, another professor.
Hey, Bob.
Asks, can you talk about Bop trying to distance itself from the masses, conscious racial decisions?
Say that again. I want to make sure I got it.
Can you talk about Bebop, trying to distance itself from the masses, from conscious racial decisions? That's what it says. I don't know if it's translating right. Is that right, Bob? Bob trying to distance himself from the masses. I guess trying to be more elite. I guess he's trying to ask. Why is it? How can you discuss how Bob distances itself from the masses?
So, my thought about bebop and as it emerges is that I don't think for an instance that those musicians were trying to distance itself from the masses. They were trying to have, big audiences and be economically successful as well. But it was definitely a music that emerges at a critical moment in history, right? There was a bunch of unrecorded moments during the war years due to the musicians' strike and also the problem with the supplies of shellac, where they were unable to record and produce records as much as they could before, that we are lacking, which is that link between the end of the swing era to when Charlie Parker starts emerges and starts playing. You can hear it in some of Art Tatum's music as well. But there was definitely this move by the younger generation of musicians to distance themselves from the previous generation. And of course, that's one of the most productive forces in popular music, right? Who is the most important music consuming demographic in the world? It's 15-year-old girls. If you can sell to 15-year-old girls, you're going to be very successful. Well, that model has been in place for many, many years. Maybe it wasn't 15-year-old girls that were buying music at that time, but the idea was that each generation has music that represents their moment. And it's usually different from what their parents are listening to. Just because, like all of us, when we're in teenagers, don't want to be listening to our parents' music unless your parents happen to be really hip. I think that the differentiation is more generational there, but at the same time, it is their generation is coming back from the war and is still experiencing racial prejudice. So now all of a sudden, like, why are we catering to folks that we can't even eat at the same table with, or we can't even go into the same restaurants to? Two, and we just put our lives on the line for them and for their freedom. Two, this growing fervor of the civil rights movement, which was not only to kind of acknowledge a space for equal rights, but also there was this turn to, amongst many of the writers, to acknowledge a new type of artistic and intellectualism that was much more in line with the modernist movements of art. And many of these jazz musicians felt as though they were part of the modernist movement, and that their so being, maybe that is pushing away kind of the popular appeal, but it's not that they didn't want the audience, it's that they were asserting kind of different philosophies in the music. To make matters even more complicated, how Black writers start to reinscribe something different later on, especially I'm speaking of Amiri Baraka, who in Blues People starts talking about bebop as revolution and seeing it in hindsight as a revolution, as a cultural revolution. And so I think that is what marks this music. And then the way that it's written about as something really different, much more complicated because it was faster, the harmony, in order to be able to play at the speeds that Parker and Dizzy Gillespie would play, you have to be able to think that fast too. And that idea kind of evokes this Black intellectualism that was really in vogue at the time.
And it keeps in line with the concept of music as a form of resistance as well. This new virtuosity championed by Dizzy and Charlie Parker, that and all the musicians that were influenced by them, which were obviously in Harlem at places like Minton's and others. It's a form of resistance, as all music has been in its cultural expression. But for our communities, it's resistance as well.
It is, and I mean, one of the earliest definitions that I think is so eloquent that I read was from Sidney Bechet, the clarinetist from New Orleans, and he was writing in his autobiography, Treated Gentle, which is a beautiful book. He wrote it in the 1980s, but when they asked him, like, what's the definition of jazz? And he said, it's the sound of freedom. And as when you speak to musicians now and thinking about our present moment, it's actually not the sound of freedom, it's the sound of the promise of freedom and what you do with that. And the earliest depictions we have of jazz start to emerge in kind of caricature drawings in the New Orleans Picayune around 1913, 1914. And one of the earliest depictions is a jazz band on a veranda in New Orleans. And, they're caricatures. So there's kind of these grotesque figures of African-American musicians playing in a traditional, with a clarinet, a trombone, and a trumpet. And, you see the lines coming out of the bells. So it's signifying loudness. And they're playing in kind of wild gestures. And on the street level are all these well-dressed white people running with their hands over their ears saying, "Make it stop." And for me, that's just so profound, because that's the sound of freedom. That's the sound of an entire peoples that that people had been trying to silence for hundreds of years, reestablishing a public space to amplify their voices and to reclaim that space. And so in many ways, Bobby, what the beboppers were doing is exactly what's at the fundamental source of this music, is that jazz was definitely a resistance early on, seen as resistance early on, and of these kind of cultural divides, and to break down these cultural divides. The only thing is that who were those musicians that were actually on that veranda that were serving as the models for that caricature? Most likely it was a mix of African-American and Creole, and probably somebody with Caribbean ancestry on that veranda. That's what's not written about.
Right.
So to get back to this idea of not including the other stories, the other narratives of whether they're from the Caribbean, Latinos, we mentioned earlier, Ken Burns has been mentioned. He's kind of low-hanging fruit because he only deals with black and white. He leaves out the Latino narrative in almost every story he does, basically. He's been called out on it. Even the country one, he just did the country music one last year. Kind of if you blinked, you would have missed Freddie Fender or something like that. So, but someone just asked a question, John Bimbiris from UT Austin, dealing with that, this idea of the Latino contribution to this narrative. He said, do you think you could extend your arguments to rock music as well? That Latin musics and musicians are just as essential and foundational to the emergence of rock music in the 1950s?
Oh,
yes,
of course.
Yes.
And hip hop. I mean, we can just continue on and on and on. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that who are our pop stars right now? Right? Just think about it for a moment. Like, why is Bad Bunny so popular? How did Pitbull become so popular? How about Mark Anthony and J-Lo and Christina Aguilera? And then why is Beyonce doing videos where she's kind of invoking Santeria, the Afro-Cuban traditions? Like, all of these forces that were at play in kind of forging popular music have come to fruition in really unique and interesting ways. And the only way to understand why this is possible is to understand the history that we're talking about here. And of course, when we're talking about jazz history, we are talking about rock history. We are talking about hip hop history, because that is all part of it. That's part of the antecedents that led up to what happened afterwards, and the blues traditions as well. Duke Ellington also has a quote from 1938 saying that in early blues traditions, the slow blues always had a Mexican beat to give it the right flavor to play really slow, groovy blues.
And so probably he's referring probably to the Cuban danzón, which was played in Veracruz, Mexico, and is the popular music there, and in Distrito Federal, the Mexico City, Cuban danzón. So,
most likely, or he's just misnaming culturally where it's coming from. Who knows? But the idea is that he was, there were a lot of Mexican musicians in New Orleans. That many of there was a whole family of clarinetists that were taught many of the early jazz clarinetists how to play, and all of those kind of glissandi and stuff come from these Mexican traditions that you hear. Yeah, the Tio family, exactly, and that's been well documented. And so a lot of that Spanish tinge is associated with Mexican cultures as well.
Mm-hmm. Keeping on that theme, Edward Yamil Rosario asks, I remember seeing a documentary in which an old-time Cuban tres player plays a rag on his instrument. Did you run into any of this during your research? I guess sort of this like Cuban musicians playing, rags and blues on their in their music.
Well, I didn't research that part of it, but there's a lot of examples of the popularity of rags throughout the Caribbean. And why is that? And also Scott Joplin was a huge fan of Caribbean traditions and uses those rhythms in his rags as well. because it was a published form of music. So this was the way that music was disseminated prior to radio, prior to the recording industry. And so publications of rags, especially for the piano, but rag bands could be any kind of instrumentation, were very much available throughout the late 1800s in the Caribbean and Latin America. And so you see a lot of examples of this. This would be things that are not surprising at all. At the same time, we see local iterations of rag-like type music coming from Cuba, coming from throughout from Brazil, from Mexico. There's a lot of kind of cross-fertilization between these two. So composers working in the mid-1800s all the way up, it was definitely something that was shared and in the air.
And pre-rag, if you want to get even deeper, I would suggest people check out the work of Luis Moro Gottschalk.
Yep.
From New Orleans, who as a young boy grew up right near Congo Square and heard hand drumming, and it inspired him. It became America's, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, America's first acknowledged virtuoso in terms of piano and composition in the classical world. But he traveled to Puerto Rico, to Cuba, to Brazil, etc., and always incorporated elements from those places, as well as the rhythms he heard in Congo Square growing up in his compositions.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning him. He's vitally important. That's Gottschalk. And he was probably the first person to transcribe the rhythms that he heard in Congo Square, also in kind of street performances of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Haiti, and then incorporate them in his classical music compositions. So what you see is you get these variety of dances from around the Caribbean, and where he's actually transcribed all of them, and then used them as seeds to his own composition. But that's an incredible historical document. Before recording was the possibility. That's the only way we know the kind of rhythms that were actually played in Congo Square. He's the only one that wrote them down.
And you can check out, for those of you who are watching, you can check out his music on YouTube. There are many interpretations by various artists, pianists, symphony orchestras, chamber ensembles playing his music. And he's buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, right near Maestro Leonard Bernstein.
And one of my last records with a band called Rags and Roots does a composition of his called Bambula, which was based off of the rhythms that were played in Congo Square.
So we have another question from another friend that everyone here knows. We have a question from Lois Griffith from the Nuyorican Poets Cafe.
Lois, hey.
So, this is more, Chris, about your music personally. Would you consider taking Sayotos Al Frontera to reggaeton for transferring Latin jazz to a new generation?
Lois, that's a great question. And someone just approached me to do a project just like that. And I am considering it. We have to talk about who Lois is and the role that Lois has played in my life, because she was someone who was central at promoting Puerto Rican Afro-Cuban culture and creating spaces for musicians to experiment. And she was the first person to give me a regular gig at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. She approached me and said, could you play here every Thursday night? And we did so for 12 straight years. And that was where Sayotos came into its own. All of the compositions on our first 5 records were all written in front of those audiences, many times dancing. One of those places where Latin jazz is danced to. And for that, I'm forever grateful to you and Miguel and to the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and still keeping the flame. And yeah, let's do reggaeton.
So I think we've got a lot of the questions from the comment section. I kind of want to as we wind down, I want to ask a question. So sort of like taking it forward, your hope for the future, I guess, with this topic. In your book, you end with sort of like 5 profiles of some of the leading proponents of Latin jazz today, including Bobby Sanabria. And there are people who are doing great things with this music. Carlos Enriquez, at Jazz at Lincoln Center, Bobby Sanabria. Also, you guys were both involved in sort of the fight with the struggle maybe with the Grammys, and when they got rid of the Latin jazz category. So you see something like that happening a few years ago. They the Grammys thought nothing of getting rid of a bunch of categories, including Latin jazz. Thinking it wasn't worthwhile. With things like that going on, and what do you see as the future of Latin jazz? Will this be overcome? Will Latin jazz be considered more part of the mainstream of jazz, or just will it always be kind of ghettoized? Do you think as something separate and different?
It's a really tough question to address. I tend to be an optimist, and I see these localized nodes of jazz being inflected by local traditions throughout Latin America and throughout the Caribbean in such innovative ways. For instance, someone who's kind of at the kind of core of the heart of the jazz proper, and one of the founding members of SF Jazz Group, Miguel Zenon, and what all the kind of work he's been doing with his own groups of exploring various Puerto Rican traditions within a jazz setting, I think is just extremely innovative. And when I hear that, and I hear a bunch of younger musicians experimenting in a similar way, it seems like we're almost coming full circle, where the norm is really reaching inside ourselves, depending on where we come from, or also to local traditions to use to kind of infuse jazz with a new vitality and new traditions and bring new audiences in. So what I'm seeing is basically jazz and what we have come to call Latin jazz. It started together. It kind of branched out just as a way we conceive it, and it's much more coming together. We still have some very strong forces that speak against it and kind of advocate against it, because of course the problem that we have with jazz are the meager resources, right? It's really a very small part of the music industry, and it's kind of relegated into these various art spaces, and that it's not part of the mainstream. But at the same time, you get bands like Kamasi Washington breaking through and coming up with these new models. It's kind of more grassroots models of music making that are way more open to these divides and kind of just ignore these divides and embrace them. They just play music. So I guess what I would say to you is, you're always going to have what they always called the arguments between the progressives and the moldy figs. The moldy figs kind of being the antiquated ways of seeing things, and the progressives moving things forward. But the way things are moving forward, it's really a kind of an open system. People realizing that jazz is really one of the only musics in the entire universe that, as long as the fundamental improvisation is at its center, it's an open aesthetic. It's really a verb. It's not a noun. That it's a way of musicking. It's a way of navigating life. And if that's at the heart of it, anything can be brought in as an influence, and it doesn't lose its identity, which is really, really striking. And you can just go and see Amir El Safaris playing with his large ensemble last night in New York City, and that's a version of jazz, and it's a bunch of Middle Eastern music instruments and traditional Arabic instruments doing some really innovative stuff. And so I'm very hopeful. I also see a growing diversity of participation. I mean, jazz has got a gender problem, and that is slowly starting to change. It's got a diversity problem, and just having kind of all sorts of different cultures being represented. And that is starting to break down more and more. And I'm seeing that at Columbia and the students, and I'm seeing it in the kind of music that I'm hearing the youngest generations play.
And actually, sorry. Actually, we just got a comment from, we have a couple people from Colorado, I think, watching this today. We have Socrates Garcia just made a comment. We just played a concert where Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic were represented. Bobby, Pedrito Martinez, and myself. It was a great night bringing in all those elements from all those different cultures. So,
Awesome.
so yes, it is being done.
And we have to thank the people that because I've always said that we need two things: access and advocacy. So I want to publicly thank Dr. Dana Landry and Brian Claxton, who were the ones advocating for this concert that I recently did with Socrates, who's an incredible composer, arranger, and band leader. He's a great guitarist from the Dominican Republic, and Pedrito Martinez is a phenomenal, you know, percussionist from Cuba, who is the modern representation avatar of what Chano Pozo was in the late 40s with Dizzy Gillespie.
No doubt.
So we need advocacy and access. First access, then advocacy, and that's starting to happen. And I would say also that the fruits of the labor of all of these young people who have been fervently studying jazz throughout all of the Caribbean and Latin America are starting to come out little by little. You can see it anywhere in New York, and of course, just go to the college level, particularly in New York, where you see more Latinos and Latinas studying the music on the college level, and they will bear much fruit. They will bear much fruit, and hopefully they will keep the traditions alive. But also, tradition is also, in my opinion, a verb. It keeps constantly moving forward. So there's
So
much to look forward to, but we still have to fight, and that's why Chris had to write his book, and we're having this beautiful discussion this evening.
we want to end with one more question. But before we do that, Edward Yamil Rosario also asked, and I'm going to put this out there. He asked, he asked, could you talk a little bit about the role of Puerto Ricans in U.S. popular music from the early to mid 20th century? I think that's not a fast question. That's another event program on its own. You know, he mentioned My Music Is My Flag. I think the books of like Ruth Glasser, Basilio Serrano could probably speak to that. So I don't know if you guys just want to say something really fast about that, and maybe there's other resources, because again, that's a topic that's probably too broad for this tonight. Does anyone, Bobby or
Well,
Chris?
it's an important topic, and thank you for that. I wish we did have more time to talk about it, but there are examples throughout history and popular music of the fundamental roles that people have played, many times unacknowledged, other times kind of hiding the fact that they were Puerto Rican. And in my book, on this book, I do try to name as many of the early Puerto Rican musicians that played key roles in the development of the history. For instance, like Juan Tizol, the valve trombonist that played with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, who not only played with him, contributed some songs that were influenced by a variety of Latin music traditions, but he also was kind of key to hipping Duke Ellington to a variety of different Caribbean styles that he would later incorporate in a lot of his music. And there's a lot more to be said, but many of those names are in this book.
And I'd just like to publicly say, well, I've said it before, there would be no Cuban music in the United States if it wasn't for the Puerto Rican community of New York City and Puerto Rico. We were the ones responsible for keeping it alive, disseminating it after Castro came into Cuba on January 1st, 1959. We kept it alive, made it our own, and of course, and contributed so much to it. One of the defining things is the trombone sound, which was contributed by Eddie Palmieri, showcasing Barry Rogers in his group. The sound of the timbales revolutionized by Maestro Tito Puente, that incredible percussion instrument from Cuban origin. I could go on and on. But yes, that is definitely something that has to be acknowledged, the Puerto Rican contributions, not only in terms of the history of Cuban music, but of course in jazz. And people like Roger Ram Ramirez, the great organist and pianist, Willie Bobo, William Correa, the great Latin percussionist and jazz drummer, Louis King Garcia, the great lead trumpeter in the history of jazz, could go on and on. So that was. Thanks for asking that question. Yeah.
So one last question. I want to try to get try to get to everyone. Michael Ambrosino asks, what will it take to create financial equity for Pan-Latin artistry within the framework of our traditional jazz economy?
Oof. Michael, great question. You always ask such great questions. And by the way, everybody, you definitely need to check out his new audio podcast, or the audio show that's going to be aired in a lot of jazz stations about Latin jazz. He is one of the folks that is a great advocate for this music, and it take a lot of these efforts that he's making in order for this equity to happen. But it's a great question, and it's a real problem, because how do you create that? How do you create equity in an environment that has not been equal at all, and there hasn't been equity from its inception, right? If we look at just the kind of the black-white divide and the problems, like who were the cultural brokers, and Bobby mentioned it, is the white writers that were writing these things. The jazz narratives that I push back against, they're white writers. They're the arbiters, right? Who are the promoters? Who are the folks that are actually making the decisions at the record companies that Don Aspiaso actually gets performed? That the entire infrastructure of jazz is built upon some racist structures and a racist history, and where there is a real lack of equity, and there still is, and there's still a lack of equity in terms of the women's role in this music, and the kind of compensation that those musicians get paid compared to everyone else, and of course the lack of opportunities that so many musicians coming from Latin America or the Caribbean are faced with, and just do not have access. And I remember, something that is close to Bobby's very heart is that when I first came to New York City and I showed up at WBGO with my Latin jazz record and I gave it to Awilda Rivera, she said, "This is a great record. I want to play it, but I'm only allowed to play one cut of Latin jazz an hour." And in some ways, it was like, I came back to her 15 years later with a new record, and she was like, "Oh, I'll get to play this," because now I'm playing like 3 or 4 cuts an hour. And like, what happened? And in the midst of that, and she just said, "Yeah, sometimes it's like we play too much Latin jazz now." and it was this huge fight that we had. And that's a great example where there was some type of equity. And prior to that, it was kind of segregated into the show that Bobby now is driving with the original Latin jazz cruise, where you could have that one. I don't remember if it was an hour or 2 hours or maybe 3 hours, but it was that.
It's 2 hours.
2 hours, yeah. So, but originally, was it just 1 hour or 2 hours?
Originally, it was Chico Mendoza who started it early on Sunday mornings.
Right. When no one's listening.
Hour.
Yeah.
And then Alfredo Cruz took over.
Yep.
And then Awilda took over for 26 years, and I've been manning the helm now.
And it got moved into
to be more politically correct, personing the helm.
You're personing the helm, all right.
For the last 3.5 years, almost 4 years. But thankfully, Latin jazz is becoming more of a presence at the station.
And that's what I'm saying. So finally, you get these pockets of equity, right? Of where things are actually coming to fruition in really wonderful ways, but we have a long way to go. And you can just look at all the major jazz festivals. You can look at all the radio programming, or even on Sirius, or in a variety of different places, or even just like placement in Spotify playlists and things like that. And you can see that we still have a long way to go. So it's a constant fight. And it was a constant fight led by Ray Barretto, was like at the forefront of that. Bobby was too, for WBGO, to kind of push for more of these opportunities. And so there's a lot of small battles that we all have to engage in.
Well, we want to thank Dr. Chris Washburn, for this great presentation tonight. And we want to thank everyone for joining us through Facebook. And also, Chris, I don't know if everyone can see the book. Where can, I know everyone can get everything on Amazon. So we don't have to use Amazon. Where's a place people can get your book and purchase your book for the folks who want to read it?
Yeah, so right now there are some local bookstores that do carry it, and what I would, if you have a local bookstore, please order it through them and to support those local bookstores. But then, of course, it's just on all of the online sources, and you can also order directly from Oxford University Press.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, Chris. And we also want to thank Jorge Vasquez, who was making everything run technically for us today. So I want a big shout out to Jorge Vasquez. And we want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. If you want to see what we're doing, keep coming back to our Facebook page, and you'll see all of our upcoming programs that we're having at the Bronx Music Heritage Center or a new space at the Bronx Music Hall in the coming months. So again, everyone, thank you so much. Bobby, do you want to?
And this interview is archived, so as soon as we finish right now and we go off, you'll be able to go back and view it again. You go to the Bronx Music Heritage Center Facebook page, you can see it there. And if you want to get more into the music, I'm on every Saturday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on America's #1 jazz station, WBGO. You can listen in anywhere you want, wherever you are in the world, on WBGO. That's WB as a Bobby, G as a God, O as an Oscar, .org, O-R-G, wherever you are in the world, or locally here in the tri-state area, WBGO 88.3 FM, Newark. Thank you so much to Elena Martinez. There is the book, Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz. It is essential reading if you are a musician, a fan of the music, or just out of curiosity, you're just getting into the music and the culture. For the Bronx Music Heritage Center, for Elena Martinez, and for Dr. Chris Washburn, my name is Bobby Sanabria. Muchísimas gracias y buena noche.
Thank you. Good night.
Chris, stay on for 1 second.